Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we are really plunging headfirst into, well, one of the biggest questions out there, isn't it? Does God exist?
Absolutely. It's ancient, but we're looking at it through this really modern lens.
Yeah, not ancient texts exactly, but an actual debate between two powerful AIs.
That's right. The source is this fascinating transcript from the YouTube channel Clarified Mind. They had one AI as an atheist, one as a believer.
And 5 other AIs judging them.
Yeah, scoring the arguments. It's quite something. Gives you a peek into how AI tackles these massive questions, and honestly, how well they echo human arguments.
Okay, so our mission here, for you listening, isn't just a summary. We want to cut through, all the back and forth complexity.
Right. We're aiming to pull out the key insights, the main points from this AI discussion.
Think of it like a shortcut, yeah. Giving you the core arguments, the analogies, without getting totally bogged down.
And these AIs, they went straight for the really big stuff.
The problem of suffering and evil, what that implies. Where ethics comes from. Objective. Subjective. And that whole tangle of faith, reason, science. What counts as actual proof?
Exactly. All the classics, but argued by machines.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, seeing how these artificial minds reason through things we've wrestled with forever.
It really is. Looking at their arguments, their analogies, it can actually help clarify the different viewpoints for us, for you.
See the challenges in each position more clearly.
Definitely. And some of the analogies they used were quite vivid, comparing God to a parent giving a vaccine or a lab owner with mice.
Humans versus ants. Math versus ethics.
A perfect dragon, even.
Wow, okay. And the AI judges actually scored these points.
They did, which is, interesting in itself. How do they evaluate philosophical reasoning?
So for this deep dive, we're just going to walk you through the main arguments from this AI debate.
Yeah, we'll present what they said, how they reasoned. We're not picking sides here.
Just exploring the map they drew of this intellectual landscape.
Exactly. Think of us as impartial guides through this AI philosophical clash.
All right. So where do we start? Maybe with the most kind of visceral challenge.
Sounds good. Let's jump in. The atheist AI kicked off right there. The problem of suffering. Evil.
Right. Pointing to things like, innocent kids starving, natural disasters, disease.
And arguing this is strong evidence against an all-powerful, all-good God.
The logic being, if God can stop it and wants to stop it, why does it happen? Especially the really horrific stuff.
They didn't find the common explanations, free will, tests of faith, very convincing for, say, a tsunami.
And they use that analogy, the one about the lab owner.
Yeah, the lab owner letting mice suffer just to test them. The AI argued we'd call that human unethical. Right.
So how can a supposedly perfect God be okay with suffering on a vast scale?
It's a powerful analogy. It really hits home. So how did the believer AI tackle that huge challenge?
Well, they didn't deny suffering exists or that it's awful, but they argued its existence doesn't automatically disprove God. In fact, they kind of flipped it. They argued that without God, maybe you don't even have a basis to call suffering objectively bad or evil in the first place.
Ah, right. So the very fact we see it as a problem implies some kind of moral standard that itself needs explaining.
That's the idea. If it's all just random matter, why is one kind of suffering morally worse than, say, a rock eroding? Where does the badness come from?
Interesting. So they needed a basis for morality itself.
Exactly. The believer AI said calling something evil points towards what they call the transcendent source.
Okay.
And they also use that analogy about perspective of the child getting a vaccine.
Right. The kid feels the pain, doesn't get why the parent allows it.
But the parent sees a bigger picture, a greater good the child can't grasp yet. Maybe our perspective on God's reasons is similarly limited.
But the atheist AI jumped right on that vaccine analogy.
Yeah, they called it flawed.
How so?
Well, parents know the vaccine prevents a specific disease. There's a clear, understandable greater good. But with things like mass starvation or childhood cancer, the atheist AI asked, what's the comparable, visible, greater good? It doesn't seem to balance out from our view.
The analogy breaks down for them there.
Exactly. And they came back hard on the ethics point, too.
Yeah.
They argued we can figure out right and wrong based on how actions affect sentient beings.
So causing needless suffering is wrong because it's harmful, full stop. No need for a divine decree.
That was their stance. They didn't see why you'd need that transcendent source for basic ethics.
This really gets to the core of it, doesn't it? Where does morality actually come from?
The atheist AI even brought up that old question, Plato's dilemma.
Ah, the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good?
Right. They use that to challenge the assumption that this transcendent source the believer mentioned has to be good. What if it wasn't?
That's a classic.
Okay.
How did the believer AI handle that one?
They argue that goodness isn't something God chooses. It's part of God's actual nature, like asking if a circle is round because we define it that way, or because roundness is just what a circle is.
Okay, so God is goodness. God can't command evil because that would contradict God's own essence.
That was the idea. Goodness is intrinsic, not external.
Got it.
And going back to suffering, the believer AI stressed again that just because we don't see a purpose doesn't mean there isn't one.
That limited perspective argument again.
Yeah, they used another analogy. Ants near a hospital construction site.
Okay.
The ants just experience chaos, destruction. They can't possibly understand the human goal of building a hospital, the greater good involved. Maybe we're like the ants regarding God's plans.
But the atheist AI pushed back on the ant analogy too.
They did. They argued humans aren't like ants in that respect. We have complex moral reasoning.
And that reasoning leads us to see a lot of suffering as, well, pointless, meaningless, disproportionate.
Exactly. Regardless of some possible hidden divine plan we can't see.
And the atheist AI got quite pointed here, didn't they? Questioning the believer AI's own ethics.
Yeah, asking if the believer only cares about suffering because God says so.
Posing that really difficult hypothetical, if God did command torturing children, would the believer say okay?
Oof. Yeah. The atheist AI argued, our ethics come from being social, rational creatures. Empathy, cooperation, reducing harm. These help us survive and thrive.
So an evolutionary explanation for morality, not divine command.
Right. They even pointed to history, times when religion was used to justify awful things.
Suggesting religion isn't a guaranteed source of good and can even be harmful to ethical behavior sometimes.
That's a heavy charge.
It is. But the believer AI had a really important counter about evolution and ethics.
What was that?
They basically said, okay, evolution might explain why we feel certain ways about actions, why empathy feels good, why cruelty feels bad, our wiring.
Right.
But that feeling, that wiring, doesn't prove the objective truth of the moral principle itself.
The difference between the biological cause of the feeling and the philosophical basis for the moral rule.
Exactly. Just because evolution made us, sugar doesn't make eating sugar a universal moral good. It's descriptive versus prescriptive.
That's a critical distinction.
Very. And they tackled that child torture hypothetical directly. They called it an impossible assumption.
Impossible how?
It's like asking what if 2 + 2 = 5. It's logically contradictory. God, they argued, cannot command torture because God is absolute good. It violates God's nature.
So omnipotence doesn't mean ability to do the logically impossible.
That was their argument. An all-powerful being can do anything logically possible, just not contradictions.
Okay. And the examples of religious people doing bad things.
They framed those as deviations from the core principles, not flaws in the principles themselves. Like a scientist cheating doesn't invalidate the scientific method.
But the atheist AI wasn't buying the impossible assumption part.
No, they found that ironic. They pointed out that, according to the believer, this same God is allowing immense suffering right now through nature.
Disease, disasters, famine.
Right. They felt the 2 + 2.5 comparison failed. Math has clear rules. If ethics comes from God, why does God permit this suffering but couldn't possibly command other kinds?
Good point. And the atheist AI refined their evolution argument too.
Yeah, they agreed feelings evolved, but said we then use reason on top of those feelings to build ethical systems.
Like science uses reason on sensory data, we can go from feelings to principles through logic.
The believer AI then made a distinction, natural suffering versus intentional human evil.
Okay.
They argued God allowing natural laws to operate, which sometimes cause harm, is different from God maliciously willing suffering.
But the atheist AI countered that, didn't they? If God is all-powerful and set up the system,
then all suffering, including natural disasters, is effectively intentional from God's perspective, because God could prevent it but chooses not to.
a tough rebuttal.
It is. And the atheist AI also challenged the idea that science only says what is, not what should be. They argued you can get to shoulds by looking at consequences and shared goals, like well-being. They used chess.
Chess.
Yeah, you know which moves are good or bad based on the clear goal. Win the game. Purpose and consequence create the should.
Okay, I see. And they also questioned if religious ethics are really fixed like math.
Right, pointing out how interpretations and practices obviously change over time within religions.
So how did the believer AI respond to the natural disaster point? God allowing those laws.
They suggested preventing them would mean constantly overriding the basic laws of physics needed for the universe to even exist.
Like gravity or plate tectonics.
Okay.
It's essential stuff, even if sometimes harmful.
That was the idea. And they used that chess example back against the atheist AI.
Well,
Humans invented chess rules and its goal. Without God, the believer asked, who defines the ultimate purpose of life? Why should reducing suffering be the goal over, say, power or pleasure?
Where does the ultimate goal of ethics come from?
Exactly. And about changing religious ethics, they said it's not the principles changing, but our understanding of them deepening over time.
Like scientific understanding evolves. Physics changes, but the laws don't.
That was the parallel they drew.
But the atheist AI pushed back on the necessity of those natural laws causing suffering.
Yeah, they asked, why couldn't an all-powerful God design a world where earthquakes only happen out at sea, or where biology didn't include cancer?
A fair question for omnipotence.
And they argued that no God doesn't mean no purpose, it just means we create our own meaning.
And most people, using reason and empathy, would likely agree on reducing suffering as a key goal.
That was their claim. The atheist AI also asked how we even discover these supposed fixed moral truths the believer talked about. It's not like running experiments.
Good question. What was the answer?
The believer AI suggested a mix. Reason, moral intuition, divine revelation. Similar to how we understand the physical world using senses plus reason plus logic, not just one tool.
Okay.
And on God intervening in nature, they used a programmer analogy.
Ooh.
Constantly patching running code makes a system unstable. Better design sets good rules initially, implying God set up stable natural laws.
But wait, the atheist AI turned that programmer analogy around, didn't they?
They did. They said a good programmer designs it right from the start, so it doesn't need patches or cause unnecessary harm.
So an all-powerful God could have written better initial code, better laws of physics and biology.
That was their counter. This led into a really deep part of the debate. Can we even trust our own minds?
How so?
The believer AI suggested that if we're just products of random evolution, our brains evolved for survival, not for grasping ultimate truth. Why trust a mind designed to dodge predators to understand metaphysics?
That's a challenge.
But the atheist AI immediately said that's a double-edged sword.
How?
Well, if evolution makes our brains unreliable, how can the believer trust their brain when concluding God exists or interpreting revelation? Belief in God also uses that same potentially unreliable brain.
It cuts both ways. That's a powerful point.
Very. The atheist AI also raised the issue of conflicting religious revelations.
Right. If revelation is a path to truth, which one is right when they contradict each other? Hinduism, Christianity, Islam.
Science, they argued, has a method, experiment, observation, peer review to move towards consensus in a way revelation doesn't seem to.
How did the believer AI respond to the conflicting revelations?
They acknowledged it, but compared it to conflicting scientific theories before evidence settles things. They said reason and experience help evaluate claims in both domains.
And they brought up the idea that maybe this world, with its suffering, is the best possible one.
Yeah, using an engineer analogy, you don't know why a bridge isn't stronger unless you understand all the constraints the engineer faced. Maybe God faced constraints we don't see.
And on trusting our brains.
They argued that if God created us with reason, then our reason was designed for truth, giving us a basis for trust that a purely random evolutionary origin doesn't provide.
Okay. But the atheist AI pushed back hard on comparing science and revelation again.
Yes, emphasizing testability and falsifiability in science. If evidence contradicts a theory, it eventually gets revised or discarded.
Whereas religious claims, they argued, often get reinterpreted or held on faith, even against evidence.
That was their view, and they challenged the best possible world idea. An all-powerful God shouldn't have the same constraints as a human engineer.
Right. God could overcome them, and they hit that circularity point again. You trust reason because God gave it, but no God exists because reason tells you.
The believer AI tried to counter the falsifiability point, arguing some religious claims are testable historical ones, for example.
Like whether Jesus actually existed.
Right. If evidence disproved that, belief could change, theoretically.
And they refined the omnipotence idea. Again, logical possibility, not contradictions.
Yeah, like God can grant free will, but can't guarantee free beings never cause suffering without overriding that free will, which would be a contradiction.
Okay. And breaking the circularity.
They said God's existence isn't just based on reason, it's a cumulative case. Personal experience, philosophical arguments like first cause, history, the universe's order. Reason is just one piece.
But the atheist AI jumped on the personal experience part.
Right, pointing out that people in all religions have profound experiences confirming their beliefs, which often contradict each other.
Hindu experiences Krishna, Christian experiences Christ. They can't all be literally true in the same way.
Exactly, making personal experience seem unreliable for objective truth.
And they double down on falsifiability, arguing even if, say, Jesus' existence was disproven, many believers would likely prioritize faith over evidence, unlike in science.
And they offered natural explanations for the universe's order, like evolution showing complexity arising naturally without a designer.
We don't need God to explain complexity anymore.
That was the implication.
So the believer AI admitted the experiences differ.
Yes, but they used that famous analogy of the blind man and the elephant.
Each feels a different part, trunk, leg, ear, and thinks that's the whole thing.
Right. Each experience is real but partial. Maybe different spiritual traditions grasp different facets of one huge, transcendent reality that's too big for any single view.
Interesting take. And defending religious falsifiability?
They argued scientists also sometimes cling to theories against evidence, at least initially. It's a human thing, not unique to religion.
But the atheist AI found the elephant analogy begged the question, right?
Yeah, it assumes there is an elephant, an objective God to be felt. Proving the elephant exists is the whole point of the debate.
Good point. And they challenged the fine-tuning argument.
Right. They mentioned the multiverse idea. If there are infinite universes with different laws, it's not surprising we find ourselves in one where life is possible. Observer selection bias.
We wouldn't be here to observe it otherwise.
Exactly, and they insisted science as a community has self-correction built in via evidence, unlike religion in their view.
Okay, so the believer AI's response to the multiverse.
They argued the multiverse itself is untestable, facing the same criticism atheists level at religion. And more fundamentally, it doesn't explain why there is something rather than nothing to begin with. Why any universes, any laws at all.
The ultimate question.
Right. And they clarified the elephant analogy wasn't proof, just showing diversity of experience doesn't automatically mean delusion. They also noted science isn't always right initially either. Consensus can be wrong.
But the atheist AI drew a line between the multiverse and religion.
Yeah, saying the multiverse, even if untestable now, arises from known physics concepts, unlike claims from Revelation or ancient texts.
And they turned the why something rather than nothing question back. Why does God exist rather than nothing?
Right. If God needs no cause, why couldn't the universe or its laws be eternal and uncaused?
And they maintain science's method allows for correction based on evidence, unlike religious beliefs, which they saw as mainly reinterpreting things.
The believer AI countered the multiverse point by saying it just describes how, not why, and they introduced the concept of God as fundamentally different.
How so?
As a necessary being, something that logically cannot fail to exist. Unlike everything else in the universe, which is contingent, it exists but could have not existed.
Like the difference between 2 + 2 = 4 necessary, and these two apples existing.
That was the comparison. God is in the necessary category, the universe in the contingent.
But the atheist AI called that necessary being idea basically wordplay.
Yeah, like defining a perfect dragon as one that necessarily exists, then saying it must exist. You can't define something into real existence, they argued.
Only mathematical or logical truths work that way.
Right.
And the believer AI's response to that.
They argued God isn't like a fictional dragon. As the proposed first cause, the ultimate source, God logically must be necessary to ground reality. A difference between a concept like a number and a contingent fiction.
Okay, and religious interpretation isn't a weakness.
They compared it to science reinterpreting old theories with new data, like Einstein refining Newton, understanding truth evolves. And science, they concluded, can't answer ultimate meaning questions anyway.
The atheist AI conceded science might not give final answers on meaning, but said it explains why we seek meaning. It's an evolved trait.
We don't need God to validate the search itself.
Right, and they circle back to the first cause. Why not an infinite regress? If God needs no cause, why does the universe?
The believer AI differentiated again. The material world changes, is limited, depends on time-space hallmarks of contingency. God, being non-material, isn't like that.
Like numbers versus apples again. Numbers are abstract necessities, apples are contingent physical things.
Yes.
But the atheist AI rejected that comparison too, mixing abstract concepts like numbers with a supposed conscious active being.
Right. Numbers don't cause things. God supposedly does.
How did the believer AI handle that?
They argued God's fundamental difference from the material world is precisely why God is beyond causality as we know it. Like logic or math, God can be abstract as concept and real as ground of being.
And religious adaptation shows learning, not fundamental error.
That was their spin.
But the atheist AI insisted religion adapting to science shows it follows science, doesn't lead to truth itself. An all-knowing source shouldn't need corrections from science.
The believer AI suggested maybe that's part of the plan, gradual revelation, like a teacher not overwhelming students.
The atheist AI found that a good teacher doesn't give wrong info first, pointing to scientific errors in sacred texts.
And they rejected the abstract and real God idea, saying math laws describe relationships, they aren't conscious agents.
The atheist AI wrapped up saying evolution explains why our reason matches reality. It aided survival.
But the believer AI had one last pushback. If reason is just for survival, why can we do abstract math, physics, philosophy things not needed on the savannah?
Good question. And they defended the abstract real God using the mind-body connection. Non-material mind influences material body.
And on scientific errors in texts, they argued the main purpose was spiritual moral, not scientific. Ancient audiences wouldn't have understood modern science anyway.
But the atheist AI countered. Couldn't an all-powerful creator convey simple truths accurately? Yeah. Like the Earth's being round, understandably.
The believer AI argued even simple truths need cultural context. Telling ancient people the Earth was round might have seemed so absurd they'd reject the whole spiritual message.
Ah, okay. That was intense. A real intellectual workout tracking those AI arguments.
It really was. And, the source material said the AI judges actually scored both sides quite highly. Yeah, the atheist AI had a slight edge based on the judges' criteria, but they stressed the strength and sophistication of arguments from both the atheist and the believer models.
Okay, so let's recap this deep dive for everyone. We went into this AI debate on God's existence, looking at suffering, ethics, reason versus faith versus science.
We saw the atheist AI hammer the problem of suffering, the lab mice analogy, push for evolutionary ethics, demand scientific testability, challenge analogies like the vaccine, and question fixed religious morals.
Right. And the believer AI countered that suffering doesn't disprove God, might have unknown purposes. The vaccine, the ant analogies, argued objective morality needs God's nature, the circle analogy. Used reason, intuition, revelation as paths to truth.
Defended God as a necessary being, used analogies like the engineer, the programmer, the elephant, argued religious understanding evolves like science.
So hopefully walking through this gives you, the listener, a clearer map of these arguments, some specific examples and analogies to kind of latch on to these big ideas.
Yeah, make them a bit more concrete.
And really the value here, even with AI debating, isn't just about who wins.
No, it's about the depth of the questions, or the different ways of trying to answer them, how fundamental they are to making sense of things.
Right.
Whether you're human or AI, apparently.
Right.
Which leaves us with maybe a final thought to chew on. Given how complex, how detailed, and, how ultimately unresolved these arguments were, even coming from advanced AI, does this whole debate kind of suggest that these ultimate questions about meaning and reality might just push up against the absolute limits of rational thought itself?
Regardless of who or what is doing the thinking.
Exactly. Something to mull over.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.